Hello, welcome back to Outlandish Claims, everyone. I'm here with Demetrius and Mike. We're ready to talk some baseball history. Now, gentlemen, the topic was best players in MLB history. Now, you can do this. You can do this in many different ways. The first way, you can just give me 3, 5, 10 players you think are the 10 best. However you want it, that's fine. You could also do it with the best player for specific franchises if you want. So as to avoid the argument of who's the best player of all time, and you're stuck between Pete Rose, Babe Ruth, Barry Bonds, all that stuff that I know that Mike will be struggling with because of his Bonds love. And
Those
to
are
be
some very
fair, even
auspicious names.
pre-steroids, he was a great hitter. I always give him that credit. Pre-steroids, he was a great hitter.
All right. So I've got three names in particular that hit home for three different reasons. One, starting with my Yankees. Okay. I think that when you talk about any greatest player of all time and really greatest player in the history of sports conversation, you have to mention Babe Ruth, right? When you talk about a guy who was as dominant as he was, not only as just a hitter, but also a pitcher. I mean, this guy had, for all of his offensive accolades, under a 3 ERA, I believe, as a pitcher. That is unheard of. And I hear the argument that some people make by saying, oh, well, he didn't play against black players. I don't necessarily hold that against Babe Ruth because he wasn't the one that was banning them from the game at that time. He played against only who he was able to play against. And so I think when you think about Yankees history, baseball history, and sports history, the fact that Babe Ruth stories still get told to this day, despite a lot of people from his lifetime not being here any longer, that's just the reality of the situation and how history speaks to how great somebody was. The next one, who I would personally have as number 2 on my list, would be what Adam had previously disclosed to the audience, and that's going to be my one and only Barry Bonds, my favorite player of all time. Yes, at number 2. When you look at the...
Oh, no, I'm counting the number I got right so far. I picked 2 of them. I'm waiting to see if I got the third one, but keep going.
All right. I mean, listen, scandals, controversy aside, when you just look at the raw numbers, Barry Bonds is arguably the most dominant hitter in the history of the game. When you look at all-time season-by-season accolades in terms of OPS, Barry Bonds has had the 3 most efficient and strongest overall performances from an OPS perspective in MLB history. 2002 with a 268 OPS, 2004 with a 263 OPS, and 2001 with a 259 OPS. Now, 2001 was the season in which he hit 73 home runs for the single season record, and still that ranks at 3rd on that list. That shows you how dominant Barry Bonds was. 40-40 club, 762 home runs, a beast on both ends of the field when it came to both offense and defense, and led 2 franchises to postseason success, even though it never culminated in that championship. Obviously, the Angels were who the Giants had run into in the early 2000s, and then some of those battles with the Braves back in the day that we weren't even really we were so young we didn't understand what was going on. That speaks to the greatness of Barry Bonds. But my first overall choice for greatest player of all time is none other than the great Willie Mays. Willie Mays, for me, is the most well-rounded baseball player to ever touch the face of the earth. A 302 batting average lifetime, 660 home runs, went to the military, mind you, came back after the military only to win the World Series in 1954. He's third all time in wins above replacement with 149 total. He is a 24-time All-Star. A 24-time All-Star. And granted, some of that came where 2 All-Star games happened in a season, but 24 times making an All-Star game, that is unheard of. I think only Hank Aaron rivals that with 25, okay? 12-time Gold Glove winner, 2-time MVP, 338 total stolen bases, one of 3 center fielders in the 50s playing for New York teams alongside Duke Snider and Mickey Mantle to go to the Hall of Fame. And this is not even counting his Negro League success, where in 2 seasons he helped the Birmingham Black Barons to the Negro League World Series where they lost to the Homestead Grays. This man's resume is unmatched. It's impeccable. And when you talk about the cultural impact that Willie Mays made and had on the game during a time where segregation was still highly prevalent in Major League Baseball, there's a reason why the Jason Haywards when they were young, the Andrew McCutcheons of the world, all look up to and arguably owe the contributions of Willie Mays their great due and their just due for how we're able to appreciate Black players within today's game. And so for me, that's what makes it a no-brainer.
If I had to give my top 3 players not by position, of course, because it's like they're all from different parts of the field. If I could, I'd say my favorite pitcher of all time is Eric Gagne, without a doubt. Growing up in the mid-2000s, there isn't a pitcher I love more than Eric Gagne. That streak of saves he had was during my preteen years or something like that. And that was when I was watching baseball more than any other sport ever. I'd spend my summer days just waking up watching SportsCenter highlights like it was nothing. And all I keep hearing is Eric Gagne. So I'm like, how good is this dude? That's what there was a streak of 82 straight saves, if I'm correct. Yeah, Eric Gagne was nuts. And the other thing that made him cool was the goggles. That's Eric Gagne made wearing goggles look cool.
84 saves in a row, not 82.
84. Wow. It's even better. Yeah. My favorite catcher of all time is obviously Mike Piazza. Been a fan of him my whole life. Heard he's a big fan of rock and roll. Started listening to rock. Started playing drums. It's a big deal. My favorite outfielder / favorite player of all time is Andrew Jones. Not just because he's from Curacao, not just because when I went to Curacao in 2005, you'd see Andrew Jones memorabilia galore. I actually bought an Andrew Jones bobblehead doll and lost it before I got home. But Andrew Jones, great power hitter, one of the best defensive center fielders of all time. I remember hating Chipper Jones but loving Andrew Jones because why? I'm a Mets fan. It was bittersweet hating the Braves because you're a Mets fan, but your fellow countryman is one of the cornerstones of the franchise. But the main player I want to talk about, who's honestly very underrated, but in my eyes is one of the best players to play this game, Chase Utley. I really like Chase Utley. Chase Utley is close.
I'm so sorry. I reacted. I thought you said. I heard Chase Utley. My brain reacted like you said Chase Headley, and I was waiting for Mike to tell you.
No, get out of here. The echo. I can hear it. Chase Utley is without a doubt one of the more underrated, not only second baseman, but baseball players in history. Yeah, sure, you've got your Ryan Sandbergs, Roberto Alomars, Craig Biggios, but if any of those guys have almost 2,000 hits and less than 1,200 runs scored or RBIs with a batting average below 280, I'm not sure. But how many of them have won a ring and have been this good at hitting and have been one of the more underrated defensive second basemen in baseball history, and have also been one of the best base runners in baseball history? Which, sure, you won't look at that and think, oh, base running, that's definitely something you want to look at as a stat. Doesn't need to be.
I find it ironic, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but the irony in a Mets fan talking about Chase Utley running the bases. How can you talk? I know.
Base
running is why you should hate him.
it sounds sacrilegious, and I get that, but at the same time, game recognized game. As a second baseman myself, I remember watching the '08 World Series. Yes, Adam, I said it. The '08 World Series. Longo, I'm sorry. I love you, but Chase Utley, corners, him alongside J-Raw, middle infield magic.
You see, I would agree with you if he didn't shatter Ruben Tejada's leg in the 2015. What was that? LCS?
NLDS.
In the NLDS. I mean, how do you mention Chase Utley not only in the greatest players conversation, but as a Met fan when he shattered Ruben Tejada's leg?
That's what I'm saying. It was ridiculous.
It is. And
you think he's one of the best players in MLB history?
Outside of that, I'm looking, as my mother would tell me, I'm looking at the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is he's got great stats. He's won a championship. Two fingers at him. Thank you.
Just keep going. Just keep going.
Look, all right. Backlash is welcome, and I don't care because Michael, I'm sure backlash being a part of your favorite player is definitely a thing that happens. Chase Utley isn't my favorite player, but he's underrated, and I like him.
Okay, but who do you think the best players in MLB history are? That was the question, not your favorites. Who do you think the best players are?
Ken Griffey Jr., Ichiro, and Satchel Paige.
Who's the second one?
Ichiro. Mike secretly is in love with you now because you said Ken Griffey Jr.
It's weird, believe it or not. The source I got my Chase Utley information from is from a list of team of underrated players from every team. And they have Ken Griffey Sr. listed as Ken Griffey's dad. Mm-hmm. That's it. That's how the site has him listed.
That's a dumb site then.
Ken Griffey's dad, the Reds.
That's awful. All right, so now it's my turn. I got a couple of thoughts here. Demetrius went with the favorite, so I'm gonna say couple of my personal favorites. Always gonna be Kenny Lofton, Paul Konerko, Todd Helton. Outside of the Yankees, they were three of my favorite players. Those three and the jerseys back there somewhere, the ever wonderful, great, legendary Roy Halladay. Only the second one to throw a no-hitter in a postseason game. I mean, that in and of itself speaks to his legendness.
And if I'm correct, it was in his first playoff game.
Yes. It was his first playoff game. Happened to be with the Phillies, but beggars can't be choosers. Good for Roy Halladay. Best players of all time. A little bit of a different story. Actually, to round out my 5 favorites, Joey Votto. I love him. Love my boy. Love my boy Votto. Best players of all time. Different story. Best player for the Reds ever. Johnny Bench. I don't think anybody's going to argue that. Maybe people would say Pete Rose, but I'm still saying Johnny Bench.
I wouldn't bet on that.
I mean, you probably get some outside folks.
Wow.
Joe Morgan.
No. Sorry, Mike. We applaud that joke. I wouldn't bet on that. You clever boy. You clever little motherfucker.
What did he say?
He said I wouldn't bet on that when I said people would say Pete Rose is the best Red.
Oh, you're funny.
He snuck it right in. He snuck it right in there.
I'll be here all week.
Because you mentioned 2 who played for there. Picking Seattle's best player ever is really actually very difficult because you have to pick between Ken Griffey Jr., Alex Rodriguez pre-steroids when he was a rookie and killing it regardless, and Ichiro. How are you picking one of those 3? Now, I'm personally, Alex Rodriguez can get out for me. It's between Griffey and Ichiro. And I loved them both for different reasons. Ichiro was a great hitter. Griffey was a great hitter. But Ichiro was faster and had better contact, but Griffey had more power. Ichiro had longevity, so he played with more teams. But Griffey was so elite that to see him play was a thing of beauty, whereas Ichiro playing was like, look at that guy. He can still keep going. Look at him. He's still getting hits at this age.
He could be a power hit if he wanted to.
He could. He just would have had to not switch to lefty because his dad made him. If he had stayed righty his entire life, he probably would have been hitting home runs as well as for power, as well as for average. But that just tells you even more about the greatness of Ichiro. His dad made him switch to lefty to get a couple of steps closer to first.
Right.
So because his dad told him to, he switched to lefty and he still hit like that.
He won Rookie of the Year and MVP. And then not 3 years later broke George Sister's all-time hit record.
The dude is a monster. Ichiro is probably the best Mariner in history for the Mariners, but there is no disrespect intended to the greatness of Ken Griffey Jr. And I only say that because Griffey is then eliminated because he played for Cincinnati and Seattle, and that's basically it.
Didn't he also play for the White Sox, or the remains of him played for the White Sox?
Yeah, but then he's not the best player in White Sox history, is what I'm saying. Like, he was not at his greatest at that point.
Right.
Paul Konerko has an argument for greatest in White Sox history. Yeah. There's probably people that from long ago history that I can't remember.
Big Hurt, Shoeless Joe.
Big Hurt, yes. Frank Thomas, thank you. Paul Konerko's grand slam in the World Series is probably the biggest hit in White Sox history. Best player in history, though, is a really difficult one because people would say Babe Ruth. People say Barry Bonds. It's understandable. I don't agree, but it's understandable. People say Willie Mays. People say Hank Aaron. People will eventually say Mike Trout, I'm sure. And people will say Mickey Mantle, Johnny Bench, Pete Rose, Nolan Ryan.
Stan Musial.
Ken Griffey Jr.
Ty Cobb.
Ted Williams.
Walter Johnson.
Christy Mathewson.
Jackie Robinson. There's a lot.
But I believe that the true answer should be old Haas Radbourn. No other pitcher's going to win 59 games in a season. 1884. Look it up.
There's a laundry list. Miguel Cabrera is one of the recent names you could put on that list. Cal Ripken Jr., Chipper Jones, they're all Derek Jeter, Mariano Rivera, up there in contention in the discussion. For me, there's very little discussion to be had here. The greatest player of all time is Lou Gehrig. And here's why. I'm just going to read a quote from Wikipedia. Although his performance in the second half of 1938 was slightly better than the first half, Gehrig reported physical changes at the midway point. Gehrig said, "I was tired midseason. I don't know why, but I just couldn't get going again." His second half was better than his first half, and he was starting to suffer the effects of ALS. Do you know how great you have to be to have that disease eating away at you and you're actually still somehow getting better in the short term? Like the next season when it started, he was completely, and I'll read something about that in a second. But as he's starting to feel the effects, he's actually improving. And to continue this quote, although his final statistics were 295 batting average, 114 RBIs, 170 hits, and a 523 slugging in under 700 plate appearances, just under 700 plate appearances, with only 75 strikeouts. He was above average, but to put that into perspective, the previous season, he batted .351. So with the effects of ALS starting to wear down his body, he was not as good as his former self. He was more than 50 points worse than his former self. But he was still better than more than half the league. The man was a force of nature. He only stopped. He was the Iron Horse before Cal Ripken came in 2,130 straight games. The only reason he stopped playing is because he was a team player. And he said, look, I can't do it. I'm benching myself. It starts getting at him and his choice because his manager wanted to keep playing him. It was his choice to stop playing. Because his manager was like, no, let him play. When he wants to stop, he'll tell me. And Lou Gehrig told him. It really boggles the mind to me that somebody could have something so wrong with them. You felt the effects almost a year earlier, and you're still playing through it while you admit that you're starting to let go. He was 36. He still had another 4 years. It took at least 4 years away from his career. And certainly it is the only reason that Cal Ripken Jr. has the Iron Man record. 2,000 RBIs, just short of 1,900 runs scored, and just short of 3,000 hits. He had 493 home runs and only struck out in 8,000 plate appearances. He struck out less than 10% of the time.
Wow.
It's one of the biggest what ifs in sports history, but it's really not that much of a what if because it's very clear he would have passed 3,000 hits. He would have passed 2,000 runs. He actually only had 1,995 RBIs. He would have passed 2,000 RBIs. He would have well passed 500 home runs. And he certainly would have played at least another 30 straight games.
Wow.
So who knows how many more World Series rings he would have had.
Wow.
1923 and 1939, the most recognized name was probably Babe Ruth. The best player in baseball at that time and forever, in my opinion, is Lou Gehrig. Just that's how I look at it. And finally, as a shout out to Mr. Edwards, who picked Babe Ruth as one of his 3 best in history. He is one of, because him and Lou Gehrig had a beef, had some kind of issues. After Lou Gehrig passed away, or when when the movie was coming out, prior to the Yankees was coming out, Babe Ruth killed himself almost to get back into shape so that he could be in the movie for Lou Gehrig.
Wow.
He went back on, he was drinking, he was eating a lot of crappy foods because he had retired. But he worked out every single day. He starved himself with all the food. He gave himself pneumonia. He got pneumonia trying to put himself back in shape to get into the movie prior to the Yankees. He wanted to give Lou Gehrig that respect.
That's nuts.
I don't think you'll ever find a better pair of teammates than the two of them, even with their issues. I don't think you'll ever find a tandem that could do more damage than those two. On a somewhat sad note, that will do it for this episode of Outlandish Claims. We will be back tomorrow to round out the week, give our final thoughts, and call out anybody who said something stupid about a second baseman for the Dodgers. I love the look off into the distance, Demetrius. You're like, no!
You're hating.
All right, let's finish this out strong. We'll see you then.